Let's get this started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Joey, and I'm on the board of directors for the Ryerson Economics Alumni Association. We're an association run by alumni for alumni, and I'll be kicking off this event. Thank you. Let me start with saying thank you to each and every one of you for attending tonight. We're incredibly excited for you to all be joining us, and we have an action-packed hour featuring some really distinguished guests. Before I introduce our panel and moderator, there's a few things I need to mention. Firstly, we ask that everyone please ensure that your microphone's on mute. And second, while not necessarily, we encourage you to turn on your cameras. This not only helps provide a face to your name, but it can also provide visual feedback to our speakers as they're speaking. And lastly, we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for a short Q&A session from the audience. I think everyone knows the drill by now. Just please type in your questions into the chat as they come up, and then one of us will capture them and hand it off to the guests and the speakers. It'll be helpful if you have questions directed specifically at panelists, but otherwise we'll choose ourselves. And then before we officially begin, we acknowledge that Ryerson University is situated on the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon territory is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and to protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and people, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And now introducing our speakers. First up, we have Anita. Anita is currently a partner at Deloitte, and she leads a team in their economic advisory arm, which I'll let her speak to more about later. She's been at Deloitte for over a decade, accumulating a wealth of experience. Thanks for joining us tonight, Anita. Next, we have Christopher Snow. Chris is currently an engagement manager at Cascadia Partners, a boutique consulting firm in Vancouver, BC, that helps government and industry tackle big problems. Previous to Cascadia, Chris has worked at Secor KPMG. Great to have you, Chris. And then Robert Benedetto. Robert is currently a managing partner at Market Data Company, a boutique consulting firm that serves the financial information services industry. Robert has decades of experience in the world of consulting, having worked at large firms such as KPMG, Capco, and Routers. Pleasure to have you, Robert. And then lastly, introducing our moderator for the night. Dhara is a board member at REAA and is a Ryerson Economics alumni who completed the International Economics and Finance undergraduate program. She also completed her MBA at Queen's University and is currently handling business development at Instacart. I'm going to hand it off to Dhara.
Thank you, Joey, and thank you to the panelists for joining us this evening. I'm super excited to have a super candid, and I just used super twice, but that's how excited I am, but essentially hosting a candid conversation for the next hour. So to preface the discussion today, I think first it's important to start off by defining what consulting is. And the Oxford Dictionary, and I paraphrase, defines a consultant as anyone that engages in the business of giving expert advice to someone specific or to someone in a specific field of work. Obviously, this is a very broad definition and a general definition. So to help us add more perspective, Robert, I'll start with you. Given your breadth of experience, how would you define what it means to be a consultant, and what kind of consulting do you do today?
Thanks very much, Dhara. Yeah, I mean, consulting can be coined and phrased and defined in many different ways, but you know, from a young professional standpoint, I guess, as you know, the alumni and folks tend to look at their career options. Consulting is definitely one way to, you know, hone your skills and develop some capability, some expertise in a defined area, whether it's technology, whether it's domain focused in capital markets, or whether it is focused in you know, in retail banking. But I would say that you know, as important as it is to define and build an expertise around a domain topic area. What's more important about the role of consulting is learning and understanding the soft skills that go along with it. So as many of us in this in this field, we are here to kind of service our customers in a way where we help them influence their decisions. We're not really decision makers, but more so business influencers.
So would it be fair to say problem solvers, if anything?
Absolutely. We definitely solve some of the biggest problems that the industry faces.
Sure. Do you have a few examples? And, Chris, I'll also pivot to you right after, but a few examples of projects you might have done, or I guess that are industry focused, and then perhaps if they're also on the broader range.
Yeah, for sure. I think, if you date back a few years ago with the calamity of the financial services industry undergoing regulatory reform, the capital market space has definitely been an area where compliance and regulatory aspects needed to catch up with some of the rogue trading and rogue investing that the capital markets folks faced. So, catching up and providing consulting services around Dodd-Frank areas, around Volcker, those are kind of regulatory frameworks that the banks needed to comply with, although it was a time where it was kind of fluid in nature with respect to some of the consulting type projects. Definitely is an area where personally I've had some personal experience with. So
thank you. Yeah, no, that's very insightful. How about you, Chris? Any specifics or examples you can give us from your career?
I mean, one thing that I wanted to highlight, I guess, might be unique with consulting versus joining a client or going into industry, is that you are often sort of the last person they turn to in some respects. Like when you get a phone call at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, they need something the next day. It might mean you're working till 10 or midnight or whatever, but that like the clients come to you because they have no one else to turn to, and like it's all on you to get something done or get something over the line. I focus predominantly being in Vancouver in public sector work. Public sector organizations are not thought of to be the most nimble or fast moving. So there's a lot of legacy processes, procedures, policies, and technology mostly. And so things sort of continue in a way because they've always been that way. And so helping our clients through sort of large scale business transformations, typically anchored by technology replacement or implementation or whatever it might be, but also ends up pulling in process redesign and process work and sometimes some more org changes as well. And so I could get into some specifics as we continue on the conversation, but a lot of times it is, developing those business cases, managing vendors, like overseeing training, testing, implementation, go live, the whole gambit. So we like to support wherever we can throughout, and yeah, it's been a very exciting and interesting time.
Yeah, thank you. When someone thinks about consulting, I think by default, people think management consultants or B school grads giving corporate strategy advice. And from that perspective, Anita, a lot of our audience today do have an economics background. So I think there's a high interest to really understand how someone in the economic advisory arm at Deloitte, how does all of that come into the umbrella or under the umbrella of consulting?
No, that's a great question. I'd say that, in my view, that environment and that landscape for economic consulting is kind of growing rapidly and perhaps even a little bit new. I joined Deloitte probably 15 years ago, but we didn't have an economics practice at the time. That's, what I studied, and much like many of you. But I kind of fell into the commercial real estate industry for a bit, and that's what brought me to Deloitte. I joined our real estate advisory group. and spent a number of years there. And I think that's also akin to management consulting, where you may have several different careers within your lifetime within a management consulting firm. And that's been my experience to date. So I spent a number of years in that space, a bit of infrastructure advisory work as well. And Deloitte actually has a very large and fast revolution practice in economics in Australia. And Canada, we saw some of that growth taking place and decided to basically invest and develop a new practice. This was probably about 6-7 years ago. And for me, it was a natural pivot. I was already finding myself, that practice of one or two of us that would get some of those assignments that came our way. The demand was there, but then we just needed more, power behind it, more people to support that practice. So now we're probably about 35 people across the country, from one or two of us several years ago. For us, the way I think of it, it's very much what, all of you have described. We are helping our clients solve problems, answer questions. In the economic context, we're essentially leveraging economic research, analysis, modeling, thinking, theory, all of that to help answer a specific question if it's relevant. One, quick example that I would call out is just around COVID, and I'm sure we're all on this page around, our clients wanting to understand what does that mean for me from any different angle. But in the economics context, of course, it's the economic outlook is so dire, so uncertain, and what might that mean for my business, my industry, my customers, whatever that question might look like. And so we've done a lot of work with different types of clients around that. Government in particular, wanting to understand which industries have been really hard hit and just how much so, like what might a forecast look like around that, and how do they then strategize accordingly. So that's just a bit of a flavor of some of what we've seen recently.
Yeah, no, that's great. Very insightful. You said it was a natural pivot for you to move into consulting. If you had to give someone advice, specifically as they're economics students or have an economics background, as they start thinking about consulting, what would you say would be one of the advantages of joining consulting from an economics perspective? And again, we'll make this a roundtable from the different viewpoints, but for economics student, early career versus mid-career. And I feel like based on what you said, maybe it's not necessarily a norm for someone from an economics background to move into consulting.
Yeah, I think traditionally, maybe not, like, kind of to my comment around things are changing. Practice like ours at Deloitte, I know there's others that are growing in, other firms as well. So we're seeing that trend for sure. And I think that impacts graduates, out of economics. I think it's a cool new path, with the economics degree versus what we may have thought about years ago, whether it was, research, banks, government, and some of those pathways. I think economics consulting is kind of an additional new space where you might apply some of those skills, the technical, but as well as the soft skills that we've talked about, in a different light that you may not see in some of those other paths. So I think it's definitely applicable to different stages of your career. I think thinking, my one little piece of advice might be thinking more broadly beyond, how we may have studied economics in school. In a consulting world, you're wearing different hats, you're thinking outside the box. You may, cover other areas outside of economics, be collaborating with people from other parts of the firm, depending on where you're working. So those are some of the things that just jump out at me.
Yeah, no, valuable. Robert, in terms of what's your opinion on that in terms of entering, or are there significant or considerable advantage points entering consulting straight out of school? And this could be for anyone from like a business undergrad to someone that has gone to B school or like MBA. Do you think there's fundamental difference starting as a someone early in their career or an experienced professional pivoting mid-career?
No, I think, I mean, I'll give you some context in terms of where I've delved into the area of consulting, and it was a career long that I had in the data space. Previously with Reuters Information Services, my career began in the data area, and data, back in back a couple decades ago wasn't as meaningful as it is today. And just with the sum of data that's being created and how it intersects into the economics of what's being studied today. Data science is a really hot topic, and it's used in many ways, forms, and fashions in the consulting space. So as a new graduate, I think there is space for new graduates to look at consulting, but I think from how a person sees themselves in the consulting career, it's important to understand, I guess, how you believe in I'm just looking for the words, how you believe in the word in way of your career progression in that consulting space. Some folks are built for a consulting career, and some may just not like it and be discouraged in a consulting career. So from that aspect, there's a cost benefit analysis I think each individual should undertake before diving deep into consulting. I think it's important to understand what you're signing up for, because at the end of the day, the consulting is not as glamorous as people make it out to be. It's not a 9-to-5 job. I feel I have felt throughout my consulting career that you're always turned on, and sometimes it's just hard to turn it off because you're there servicing your clients. So from that perspective, I think if you look at it from a mid-career move, that might be something refreshing for somebody to get into consulting, because they have some years of experience that they've developed in their domain space. They've chosen what they want to focus on for the rest of their career, and use those tricks and tools and knowledge they have in their toolbox to practition themselves into advising and helping clients and serve clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. In terms of, I guess, even Robert, for yourself, you were with the Big Fours first, and then you moved into the boutique consulting space. How would you compare the two?
So definitely being part of the Big Four. The Big Four firms are much more mature in terms of their thought leadership. They have great amount of resources marketing themselves and putting out thought leadership for the industry. And I think the difference is in many cases is that the Big Four will groom folks for leadership positions, right? I think there's always a progressive mandate to have folks build relationships with their own clients and maintain those relationships, and eventually add value. Those relationships will add value in the end to your career. So I think it's great to be part of a bigger firm. My choice was to branch off from the bigger firm, having big firm experience over the course of my career, into a smaller boutique firm that specialized in the data space. Even though we share the same large clients, the same big clients on the street, we do specialize in our area of data, which not many folks have that kind of dedicated attention space to data. So that was my personal choice.
Yeah, no, for sure. And Chris, I feel like you have a similar story where you started off with the Big Fours and then you transitioned into, actually being one of the founding members of Cascadia Partners. So if you could give us more insight there, if you could make comparison, and if you have any sort of insights you can give us.
Yeah, I was at KPMG for 2 years. Fun fact, I got promoted on the Wednesday and quit on the Friday, and they don't like that. And I've actually been at Cascadia officially 5 years yesterday. I think LinkedIn reminded me. So it's been a pretty wild ride. I'm very much entrepreneurial at heart. So I was very excited to dig in and try and build a firm. When I joined Cascadia, there were 5 independents basically that were building under a single name, but they didn't have technology, like any company should computers. We didn't have an office space or a SharePoint or anything like that. It was very haphazard. I call it 5 guys with business cards. So when I joined, we actually made a concerted effort to build a firm. And since then, we're up to 25 or 26 people. We're on our second office space. We're about to open a location in Victoria, and all the processes and everything have come together. And one piece that I really enjoy about this is, like, I look around the office and I see things that I did. Like, I painted our first office. I've hired every single one of our employees. I set up the SharePoint. I ordered the computers. Like, I built our initial website. So being able to do the things that keep me engaged and entertained through consulting and like client billable work, but also then pivot to building a firm on the side, I think is a ton of fun. Comparison, I mean, I would echo a lot of what Robert said. The resources for these big 4 firms are limitless. I remember responding to a RFP for Coast Mountain Bus Company, which is basically the transit providers or buses in Metro Vancouver. And they have a mix of like fully electric, compressed natural gas, diesel, like all different propulsion types, battery electric, hydrogen. And they want to take the torque profiles of the different fuels and then the topography of the region and determine what fuel types they should use in each area of Metro Vancouver based on sort of the operating environment. And then with that, they want to figure out their queuing system at the end of the day, because right now, all the buses just come to the depot as they arrive. They don't park in specific areas. And so we had some ideas on how to do it, but we didn't have an expert by any stretch of the imagination. But we dug into the KPMG network, and there was some guy from Sweden who did this for Volvo, this exact thing for Volvo semi-trucks, like 3 years prior. So there we go. We like set up a call. He's on board. We put his name on a resume. And there we go. We've got a proposal together, right? That's not something that Cascadia can do, at least not in the same way. We have partnered with UBC professors and other leaders in their field when we're a little bit light on expertise, but generally speaking, we don't have that sort of like limitless resources or near limitless resources at our disposal. And as a result, we work a little bit more locally. You often see a lot more of our senior people on projects actually hands-on delivering it and not just guiding from afar. But yeah, I'd say those are some of the biggest differences, along with, of course, culture. We take a lot of pride in our culture. It's been very difficult through COVID to keep that together, but I'm in like a traditionally startup office with brick walls and wooden beams and a beer tap in the kitchen. That does not happen at KPMG the risk department than mine.
Yeah.
No, for sure. Off of that, Anita, granted, you've been with Deloitte for many years, and as Robert alluded to, and so did Chris, the culture aspect of it is very important. But I think there is this general misconception, or I wouldn't even say misconception, but maybe myths around, one, it's a rock star life, you're traveling all the time. And then the other side of it is, as you said, it's crazy working hours. There's no work-life balance. And for someone like yourself that kind of made that sort of mid-career shift, not assuming, of course, that prior to that, you weren't putting in the same amount of hours, but in the concept of, or I guess, consulting, how do you feel, or if you had to kind of, I guess, debunk those myths, what stance would you take?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I never really felt that the hours or that sort of, strenuous lifestyle that we think about for consultants, I never actually really associated with that or felt that it applied to me. I did join earlier, I'd say, in my career, that maybe I don't know any different, and perhaps I'm still missing out on what life is really like outside of, my current career. But it's been manageable. I do think there's a big distinction between also like a CPA path and needing those hours and, the accounting sort of side of it versus consulting outside of that. And there's also a distinction between sort of traditional management consulting, which, often, yes, you travel to client sites and all of that, versus a place like where I sit, which is a little bit more niche. I almost think of it, to be honest, as a boutique within a big firm, because we don't do those types of, a lot of our studies are smaller, perhaps if they're economics in nature. We can work on many of them at a time, virtually no problem, even before the pandemic. That I never really felt that strain. Like, on the personal side, I'm married, I have 2 children, all of which happened while I was at Deloitte. Never did I feel that, I was being stretched in that sense. So that to me is how I might, debunk the myth just from my own experience. But I know that that's not the case for everyone. I think it does depend where in a big firm you sit. I also think there's a personal side to it in terms of just how you operate. If you are the one to say yes to everything, then that might be what, you end up feeling. But if you sort of take on what you can manage and be honest and communicate, what you've got on your plate, because that is part of the consulting world as well, is that you may be getting asked different things from many different people that don't realize what you've got on your plate. So I think communication is really key as well, just to help manage that a bit.
Yeah.
I'd love to add a piece if that's all right. I find, and maybe you guys will agree, it's not so much the consistent long hours. At least I don't experience that the same way that the sort of stereotype is portrayed. I find it's the lack of predictability, and kind of going back to what I mentioned before, sometimes you're like the last backstop. And so a client might call you at 3 and it means you're working until 10. And like that just happens sometimes. And it sucks, but it's also kind of exciting. So I never really get too down on it. I have an 18-month-old daughter. I try to be in the office around 8:30, and I'm like closing my computer at 5:30 and I'm like gone. So I can spend a couple hours with her, assuming nothing's blown up. And then if something does happen, I need to get back online. Like all of my clients are done by 6 p.m. tops, most of them 5. And so they're not going to look at anything right away anyways. So if I need to jump on again at 8 after the baby goes down and work for an hour or so, that's fine. So I find it's less like constant hard work. It ebbs and flows before go lives or major events or like news breaks on something. But generally speaking, it's more so just the lack of predictability. Like taking vacation is kind of hilarious and a bit of a joke, because like I just got back from a week of vacation. I read my emails the entire time I was home. Still had but yeah, other than that, I don't find it to be as bad as it's made out to be. But I've been doing this for a long time, so it might be the same as Anita. I just don't know the other side.
So I came from industry, Dhara, and I know the other side, but I've forgotten the other side because I've been a consultant for so long in my career, right? So as I said before, it is really hard to turn yourself off, as Chris mentions there as well. I think, from the aspect of consulting, it's not a 9-to-5 job. And, with some respect, it could become exhausting, and the work comes on demand, and it comes I guess gated with a priority in terms of, what's the highest priority, who is asking, and why are they asking, and what have you. But there's flexibility, right? There's flexibility because it is unstructured in many ways. And, that is something that I cherish. I cherish the flexibility. Like, I kick up on a Friday afternoon and I don't really mind, right? Friday afternoon, I won't take meetings. I'll just, head up to the cottage or something, and I won't worry about it. But I'm always checking I used to have a BlackBerry, now it's an iPhone, but I'm always checking my iPhone for emails. So, but when Sunday night rolls around, then I'm on again on email, checking to see, and in some cases, you're pushing out proposals and you're doing business development over email on a Sunday evening, and it's kind of been my lifestyle since I was a consultant. And as I said before, I was shocked before coming out of industry, and I didn't think that this role was suited for me, quite frankly. But I developed a passion, a liking to it, and I haven't turned back.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you all. I feel like at this point, we're in the conversation where we've given people enough content, or I guess enough to kind of decide if consulting is right for them. So let's say they say, okay, this is what I want to do next. Chris, from your perspective, I feel consulting still, even today, people do by default think, as I mentioned earlier, it's MBA grads giving that sort of, or are in that role. You did do your MBA, and was it before you pivoted into consulting, or was it after?
Before.
Before, okay. So do you feel like it was a bridging gap, or that bridge to consulting? And is it still something you would advise people as a relevant path?
So I mean, maybe my story is a little bit different than some people on the call. I did my undergrad in business as well. So I thought my master's, while I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot, I thought it was all the same content in half the time for twice the money. I did it at Ivy because I wanted to do case-based, so it was different from my undergrad, but I wouldn't say there was like a huge learning curve. When I came out of my undergrad, as do all fresh graduates, you're like starry-eyed, young, people full of potential, and you can apply to sell paint or go into consulting, and you're just like this blank canvas. But as soon as you come out of your undergrad and you start selling paint for 3 years, now you're just a paint salesman. You're not an undergrad blank canvas with some experience. And so when I went to look to pivot, I, out of my undergrad, joined a company called Sherwin-Williams Paints and helped them with their expansion plans, so opening new stores and sales territories and that. At the end of the day, I ran a paint store, and there was no like pivoting into consulting from that. So I did my MBA to help with that. And I fully appreciate and I owe it all to that MBA that I actually made the switch. But when we go back to sort of like grads and whether they can pivot into consulting, I'd say absolutely. And even economics grads, what I look for when we're recruiting, at least, is how do you structure and solve a problem? Do you have that intellectual horsepower? Can you do that analytics, or not even analytics, analysis, just whether it's Excel or otherwise? And are you an insightful, curious, self-starting kind of person? So if you were coming out of an economics degree with a bunch of hard skills, maybe you lack the business acumen, when you start consulting, you're going to do a lot of behind the scenes analysis and research and work. You're not going to be facilitating meetings. You might be in the same room as the CEO, but you're not interviewing them, right? Like you're there in a supporting, more administrative capacity to start, and you'll pick up on a lot of these things in business acumen and that along the way. So I think it's an excellent place for fresh grads to jump in. Conversely, if you go into industry, as I think Robin mentioned as well, you get a bunch of very specific experience, expertise, and that becomes a very sellable skill. Depending what you do, you might lack some of that business acumen, and that may or may not matter. You might have a harder time transitioning into consulting later. Yeah, I highly encourage it. I think it's a great experience, great exposure to different industries, different clients. You're immediately at the table with very senior people that if you join that organization tomorrow as an employee, you wouldn't meet with. We had to work with clients, organizations, both public and private, where classmates joined, and I have like a sit down where I'm like in a meeting with the CEO, and he actually hears my opinion on stuff relatively quickly, and classmates have like never met them, and that's fairly empowering and pretty exciting all at the same time, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In terms of Anita and also Robert, are there specifics you look for from an education perspective? I mean, Anita, yours is definitely more, it's different relative to having an MBA. Do you look for a master's in economics?
Yeah, in our particular practice, we do. Master's in economics tends to be what we look for, though we do have a few folks that are outside of that. Generally, I think we're also seeing a trend with consulting where we're trying to rethink how we think about education and those credentials. And I have a separate inclusion role as well at Deloitte, and that's a big part of that. We're not only looking at the traditional BCom schools or biz schools that we typically did. How do we look broader than that across geographies, across programs, and get to that sort of inclusive skill set, which perhaps we were missing out on. Like as we solve these problems for our clients, you want to bring as many diverse perspectives to that table. So I think that's, consistently changing just for management consulting more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would echo that as well. I would echo Anita's thoughts on that too. I mean, I think we're traditionally trying to think outside the box a little bit than your traditional, graduates and MBAs in programs. And what helps us a lot is campus recruiting. So when we're out there on the campuses recruiting individuals, as Chris mentioned, I mean, I think the most important value to us in sizing and measuring whether this candidate could make it in our consulting racket is really get a sense of how they would solve problems. So case studies are very important for us to walk them through and leave them with, so that they can kind of give us a sense of what are the sorts of things that we as consultants look for in their responses and to some of the complex issues. And some individuals, from the school of from UFT or Rotman will try and solve problems mathematically, and which is pretty cool if you're in a quant or going for some sort of statistician role. But others, in terms of the management advisory and the consulting space, will try and solve the problems using a framework, a structure, an approach, and that's what we look for. We look for that kind of diversity and skill set.
That's great. Sorry, no, go ahead.
I want to ask a question. I know I'm not supposed to as a panelist. I'm going to answer it as if I were asked it, and then I'm going to turn it over to Anita and Robert, because I find that a lot of people who are considering consulting ask this question. So we have sort of, you think of like a matrix approach. There's industry verticals, and then there's service line horizontals. And so we do economics and policy, business transformation, strategy, and ops. And we would take an economics grad, and we would try to put them on all our economics and policies projects if that's what they're into. But we know that if we vet them appropriately, we're going to be able to plug them into any of the other ones. And we expect all of our staff to move freely across all of our service lines. So we, in part because we're a small firm, we don't just hire for economics. It's like, we'll put you on if that's what you want to do, but you might have to do an ops project or a tech project. That's just how it works, and we'll guide you through it. Anita, Robert, do you take a similar approach, or I almost want to say for Anita, if I'm predicting that you have like a very specific focus in economics, you don't necessarily share resources across?
Yeah, like our practice, generally is broad in terms of where you might play within economics, but I agree with what you're saying. Absolutely. I think, and we're seeing a lot more of this as well, like rotational experiences. And that's something we've introduced just as a firm recently, which economics would be a part of that, where individuals can come in with whatever program it may be. And if they're a great fit for us, fantastic. They'll rotate through a few different service areas, which will expose them to different industries as well. And then we have that sort of well-rounded candidate that they can choose where do they actually want to focus eventually, having been exposed to that, but then also have that broad-based experience that only helps them, right, in terms of consulting.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're suggesting, Chris, is, looking for candidates and setting them up with success across domains. And I think, from a data perspective in my business, data is data, whether it is, commodity data, whether it's financial data, whether it's, so we look at data is treated all similar across all fashions. You have this demand side, you have the sourcing side. So it's getting comfortable across each of those domains, as data is treated similar in all fashions. So for me, it just makes that person more valuable across the value chain.
Yeah, just a follow-up question on that. So of course, data was mentioned a few times, and as one starts to look into breaking into the industry, and they're looking to obviously uniquely position themselves so that they do get hired. Are these specific technical skills that you look for? Because I mean, granted, we talked about analytics, data. Are there specific programs that one should have on their resume that they should work on?
Well, I think from a data perspective, and our focus over the course of the last 6 months has been on the lack of transparency in data, and it's impacting climate, it's impacting environmental and social, and these are the data sources that are probably some of the hottest topics on the earth right now. And, my clients are coming to me asking, how do we take and ingest, limited sources of vendor data that's inaccurate or could be enriched with models that we've developed ourselves. And I think ESG data crosses into a little bit of Anita's world in the space of understanding how do I apply ESG information into my models, into my portfolios, and it crosses into my space essentially, because from the sourcing side of things and the disclosures and the regulatory aspects that are all kind of liquid right now, it's a space to dig into and be an early adopter of understanding the space. I think that at the end of the day will give anybody an edge in trying to figure this out with the rest of the world.
Makes sense. So I'm actually going to ask the audience, given we have about 15 minutes on the clock, to start raising. You can actually raise like a virtual hand and start asking questions in the chat. And then we can take some live questions as well.
Great.
All right, so one of our first questions is similar to a question I just asked, which is, are there any courses that you took in school or like undergrad that stand out to you after all these years in the workplace?
Good question.
I feel like I draw on a lot of them regularly, which is not a very good, it's the classic "it depends" MBA answer, I suppose. But
Yeah.
The first one that jumped to mind was the introduction to data and analytics and kind of a refresher on statistics, which I thought was very helpful. And then another one where it was more of a leadership class. They actually hired professional actors to come in and play different roles and set you up and try to trigger you in different ways. And I found that to be very helpful, both with, I think Robert mentioned, you're not a decision maker, but you're a business influencer. It helped me to reposition how I approach a certain topic or conversation or elephant in a room, how to deal with holdouts and change, that sort of thing. Those are two that kind of stand out to me.
I don't know if they do this at Deloitte. I remember at KPMG, it's a big firm. They groomed you for leadership in many ways because they wanted you to foster relationships and build a client base and then monetize it. But in many ways, they would run you through programs such as situational leadership, where oftentimes a consultant will be in a situational leadership problem-solving aspect on a project, or whether it's a strategy, and they'll have to learn how to deal with the different personalities, right? Empathy is a lot. So, there was a DISC exercise that we all learned as managing principals in the firm to say, how do you deal with, different types of personality traits and how those traits want to be dealt with, essentially. So it's again, it goes back to, how do you influence, people towards, an outcome of a business issue that you're looking to solve, right? So, and situational leadership and using, a DISC exercise and personality traits is one way on how to help get to the target at the end goal.
Thank you. So the next question we have is, how does someone get into consulting? And for the panelists across the board, they want to know, what was your childhood dream and how did you decide consulting was for you? How did you fall into it?
For me, I don't mind starting. It wasn't my childhood dream. I didn't know much about consulting, to be honest. I really didn't think about it. I did fall into it a little bit. Like I honestly applied to a posting cold and ended up getting an interview, ended up getting the job. And I learned a lot more about what consulting was about. I probably went into it being one of those people thinking I might work there a few years, see how it goes, and probably move on to the next thing. I ended up really enjoying it and not realizing, how much I would. So it was a bit more chance for me, but that was my story.
Yeah, I like to use the term professional ADD, and so I wanted to get into consulting because it was the variety and something new and whatever else. And my intention was to do it for 2 years and then exit to a client and take a job there. And I haven't found a job at a client that I would like anywhere near as much as I enjoy consulting. And 7 years on, I have no intention of leaving. So definitely wasn't a childhood dream. It was just something that kind of came across my radar one day and it sounded cool and I got into it.
That's great. So the next question we have here is from Jonathan. He's asking, what competitive advantage do economic grads bring to the table over an MBA, a stats grad, or any other technical field? I think like Python and knowing all those different programs out there is such a big thing, or at least from previous discussions I've had with economic students, they often ask, is it required? So I'll ask you that, is it required, and what advantage do economic students have?
Yeah, generally, I think of it in kind of that, what I was mentioning about the inclusive, way of thinking about how we hire. I feel like there's a great spot for economics in consulting, whether it's in a consulting practice or not. I think it's some of that technical, analytical, data science skills that you're probably bringing to the table, which can be coupled really nicely with soft skills to actually help our clients solve different types of problems, whether they're economic in nature or not. So I definitely think there's a great fit there personally.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, go ahead.
Just say economics and other skilled grads have additional credibility over an MBA. When you're an economics grad, we know there's a specific skill set there that you've been taught. MBAs are like so varied. Some people go right out of their undergrad into an MBA. Some of it's case-based, some of it's remote. Like MBAs are really, really tricky to, like, you can't hang your hat on an MBA. And this was a struggle that I had when I went into it was I'm not leaving with a hard skill like optometry or economics or something else that like I could go out and do on my own and immediately have credibility. And I think that economics and that brings that inherently.
Yeah. Robert, any additional?
No, I was just, from the aspect of that, we'd look for individuals that can be diversified in their education. I think for us, what's important is not whether they have an MBA or not whether they have or a graduate student with an economic degree, but more about problem solving and framing and structuring different types of problems to lead to a positive outcome. So from that aspect, it really doesn't matter for us. I think those skills are very unique and very hard to come by, and we look beyond the designations.
Mm-hmm. I think the general theme around MBA also comes through because there is case prep that people are almost intimidated by when they're looking to pivot into consulting or even early career. So for each one of you, do you actually do case studies through your interview process? Is that a part of it? Would you have any tips? I think that's usually where people get hung up. It's, oh, I need to prep for cases. And I guess some companies or even big fours do like 6 cases or whatever it looks like. So does that also fit your hiring style or process that you have?
Yeah, one thing I would say about solving a problem when you're presented with a case study is don't jump into it so quickly. kind of think through it, analyze it. Don't think of it as a math equation unless you're going for, a PhD level quant role, but think of it as though think of it and put your shoes in the self of, the leadership team that is trying to solve a problem. And when you do that, I think it's just commonsensical to kind of structure how you would go about solving the problem, because 9 times out of 10, they're not looking for you to solve an equation. In my business, it's more about, show your work. How would you go about doing that? Just like, you would in regular day, right? So.
The next question here is from Asha. She's asking, how do you keep yourself up to date with new technologies, skills, and processes that's given the market is emerging so fast?
I think sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Let's say podcasts, reading, like general interests. I usually set up Google alerts for client names and industry and all that, just to stay on top of it all.
Yeah. So in terms of, I guess, once you're on the job, how is performance evaluated on the job? What does that sort of career trajectory look like? Or I guess the question here is specific to career progression. Is it merit-based? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, in the Big Four environment, it's pretty much project performance based is kind of the way I think of it, because we typically are working on a number of different projects, over, let's say, a given year, that are each evaluated based on how somebody contributes to that project, how it went. And then a lot of that data is collected along with sort of the feedback of leaders to kind of inform how performance looks going forward. I think consulting, especially in a sort of a Big Four environment, there's always that opportunity for growth upwards. I think that, just as Robert spoke about kind of shaping future leaders, there's a lot of that culture. And it's kind of fed into just how your projects, are developing, but also just what the leaders, have to say about how you're doing and that kind of thing.
I think from a performance standpoint, I echo what Anita said, because I've been part of that performance roundtable discussions where it is really focused around your performance based on the project, right? In my career, I've had some really good performance reviews, and I haven't had good performance reviews, and those not so good performance reviews taught me a lot of lessons. And I think as a consultant, you're not going to always have success. You'll come across failures, but treat those failures as really reflecting on your performance and where you went wrong. So you're judged based on the outcome of a client project. You're judged on your role within that project team, whether you have a project management role, whether you're a business analyst, whether you're doing advanced analytics, and you're judged on how well, the relationships you've developed amongst your team and members. Are you easy to work with? And those are the kinds of traits that you're judged upon in a big firm. So it's all good, and it's welcoming. And I think the best thing somebody early on in their consulting career can do for themselves is put up your hand and ask how you're doing. Ask how you're performing. Ask how you're performing with the leadership team within your firm and also your clients. I think you'll get some really quality, good feedback.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice at any point in your career, to be open and receptive to feedback. For Anita specifically, we have a question. Essentially, Navina wants to know, how does one stand out if they wanted to apply for a role at Deloitte? I guess they're looking for specifics around similarities across new grads that are going into consulting. What is the common denominator you look for?
I think it probably does depend, depending on the practice and the area that somebody's looking to apply to. I think there's different things that, different leaders would tell you that they're looking for, and mine may not be the same. But I think, of course, the technical and what you're bringing to the table in terms of your, whatever you may have studied and just how you did and how you speak about those experiences and can relay them into sort of a tangible example. Like as we go through an interview question, sometimes I think that's the easiest thing that people might miss is, as you're sharing some of your answers, is tying it back to actual examples as best as you can. It doesn't have to be work experience. It can be academic, volunteer, that type of thing. I think Deloitte in general and many of the consulting firms, I'm sure everyone here would agree, we're looking for well-rounded individuals. It doesn't have to be, you're the best top performer in a specific program. We're looking for just that well-rounded individual and someone who can just tell their story a little bit. Some of those soft skills starting to come through, I think, at the grad level, I think is great. That jumps out at me often if somebody is comfortable to share their answers in a confident way, clear, great communication. Those are the types of things that actually jump out at me a little bit more, because I know that I can quickly rope that type of an individual into a client conversation right away. And, I think that's a bonus, it's a plus.
That sounds good. The other question we have is, I guess specific to, well, Robert, and I guess all the panelists can answer this. Given the pandemic and the future of work, I guess, what are the biggest changes do you anticipate in the consulting field of work across the board or as an industry?
I have opinions on where I see it moving towards. I think a lot of what we're seeing is the scarcity of the workforce. And I see the consulting aspect, in many respects, contingent labor, I see it growing. We're witnessing it, and I'm observing, in the markets south of the border to us, a sheer thirst for more and more resources, more talent around risk management. I mentioned earlier around ESG data and how that's transforming into, portfolio impacts. So it's a very, very interesting time for those looking to get into consulting. I think, we often in Canada take the lead of our big brother in the US, and right now the market for talent is quite strong. And I think it's just a matter of time before we see it here in Canada. All facets, economics, data, ESG, all of that sort of stuff. So I think there's a bright future.
Great. Sounds good. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We are at time, so I'm going to spin it over to Edmund to help us close.
Excellent. Thanks, Dhara. And so that concludes our event. I hope everyone found this event useful. I know I sure did. Before I let everybody go, I want to give a special thanks to our speakers, Anita, Chris, Robert. Thank you for generously donating your time to speak to our audience today. I'm confident that many people will take this insight that you've collectively provided and will actually use it to navigate their careers going forward. I know the industry is changing. There are many job opportunities, but you shed a lot of light on consulting, and it sounds very attractive. I also want to give a big thanks to you, Dhara, for moderating our event, and of course, the audience for making this possible. If everybody wants to follow us on social media, you can follow us on REAA_official or find us on LinkedIn for further news. And I'm sure this event will be recorded there if you guys would like to share this for further use or to your friends. So thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.